Hi, everybody. It is my sincere honor to be able to introduce you to Ms. Kenner today. She is a Westchester, Pennsylvania native and attended Temple University. She is the director of campaigns for the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. So two specific campaigns that they are working on are the We the People campaign and the Why Courts Matter campaign. So We the People is a nonpartisan campaign that aims to make state government work for everybody, no matter race, class, gender, etc. And the agenda was created by people who actually came together from across Pennsylvania. And the Why Courts Matter campaign is a nonpartisan coalition of organizations and people that are working towards filling our federal courts with diverse and well-qualified jurists that are fair and impartial and are actually upholding our constitutional values of liberty, equality, and justice for all. So I was quite inspired reading about Ms. Kenner's work as the director of campaigns. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to her.
Thank you, Samira. I appreciate that introduction. Great job. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kadida Kenner, as was mentioned, and I'm with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center as the Director of Campaigns. And I'm so honored to be with so many of you today. This is what I enjoy most about my job. And just a little background on myself. I am a graduate of Temple University. I got my degree in broadcast journalism, so I'm a journalist by trade. But I'm really enjoying this campaign work. It's issue advocacy campaign, not the political kind of campaigning. And so I'm really looking forward to presenting to you some information so that you all can go out and ensure that if you have not already registered to vote, that you can also help others register to vote. And you can prove them the reasons why it's so important during this time to be so engaged. And I know that part of your work is to making sure that we're shaping democracy here in this country, and particularly here in Philadelphia and the surrounding areas. And your voter registration and engagement work that you're doing is so important. So thank you for everything you're doing. And I want to thank Ms. Lorraine Carey and also Peter Kahn and Samira and Sonali and everyone who's had a part in organizing today's event. So thank you for having me. So I have a pretty short power presentation for you to see, PowerPoint presentation for you to see today, because I want to make sure that you can visually see why it's so important that the work that you're doing is amplified, and for you also to see what it is that you are advocating for and why it is so important that the work you're doing of registering folks to vote and talking about the importance of our democracy is meaningful, and what it's going to mean here in this coming election in November. So I'm going to just pull up my screen here for a second. Hopefully it's working okay, and we'll get right into this. All right, does everyone see my slides okay? Can someone just come on and off mute and say yes, since I can't see your faces anymore?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, so this is the start, and I'm so, being a Westchester, Pennsylvania native right outside of Philadelphia, I know exactly what John means, so you didn't have to educate me on that. So Vote That Sean is a cute way of putting this out there to make sure that we're reaching out to young folks in Philadelphia and the surrounding area about the importance of voting. And usually when I do presentations, I start off with this one from Frederick Douglass, who said at one time, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." And that quote went on and on. But I think what's so important for all of you to understand is that it's so important that you use the power that you have to make sure that your voice is being heard. And you can do that at the ballot box. So we'll talk about this. Unless you've been, living under a rock, I'm sure you heard about the passing of the great, iconic civil rights leader, Representative John Lewis, who passed away just this last Friday. He was a personal hero of mine. And it's very important that, we just give a moment here to honor this great man and the work that he did. He inspired me by encouraging us to get into good trouble. So you'll see a little bit more about that soon. But it's so important that we disrupt what's happening in our current system right now. When things aren't going well, when things aren't right, we must disrupt. We can escalate the situation, we can make sacrifices, and we definitely need to vote. And so John Lewis was always so instrumental in making sure that young folks in particular would speak up and speak out for what they believe. And he always talked about having courage, having that raw courage to do so. Here's actually a picture of myself with the congressman. This was back in North Carolina when I was working on a campaign at the time. So for me, this was very personal. His passing was like a family member passing away on Friday evening. All right, so today I want to talk to you about some of the policies that are happening in Harrisburg and in the country that are impacting you. And I understand that I'm talking to a group of folks who are about 17 to 22 years old. And so a lot of what I want to talk to you about today is what's going to be something that you can share with friends of yours, with fellow students, with cousins, with uncles and aunts and everyone else about why it's important that we exercise our right to vote and why we encourage others to do so. And there's three topics that I really want to talk about today. I want to talk about education and why that's important to talk about when you're trying to encourage people to register to vote and to go to the polls or vote by mail when they can. I also want to talk about minimum wage and wage justice here in the state of Pennsylvania. And so we're going to talk about those things, and then also taxes, a fair tax system, so that we can actually pay for all of these things. So I'm going to kick it off here with this nice little map of the Northeast region. And as you can see here in red, Pennsylvania, we have the lowest minimum wage of every state that surrounds us. We've been stuck at the federal level of $7.25 for more than a decade. And people wonder why there's so much poverty and crime and other systemic issues here in the state of Pennsylvania. It's because our minimum wage is so low, especially for cities. Philadelphia being a first-class city, we have one of the lowest minimum wage in the entire country. And make no mistake, that's part of the reason why we have so much poverty in Philadelphia, because of the minimum wage. When you can cross over on the Ben Franklin and head into Camden, and you can work in a McDonald's in Camden and make now $12 an hour versus a McDonald's on Germantown Avenue and make $7.25 an hour, that's a big difference. And so I think part of us trying to get into some more wage justice here in the state, we have to increase this minimum wage. Minimum wage is so important to pull folks out of poverty. A lot of times the argument is, well, it's just a starter job. It's just for burger flippers. It's just for grocery bag worker, grocery bag folks there at the grocery store. Well, that's not actually true. There's lots of other industries that are making much less than the $15 an hour that we're advocating for, even the $12 an hour we'd like to see minimum wage go to very soon. And if we want to add in, everything that's happening in the world today, we have the couple of pandemics going on. Not only do we have the COVID-19 pandemic, we also have the Black Lives Matter movement that's been a systemic issue in terms of racism here in the state, Philadelphia, across the country. All of these things compound. And so if we're going to bring true wage justice to folks, we need to make sure that we're raising the minimum wage here in Pennsylvania. It's very unfortunate that every single state surrounding us has a wage much higher than ours. And a lot of these states are on the path to $15 an hour. We can't even get our legislature in Harrisburg to move ours beyond $9 an hour. So we've been stuck at this level for far too long, and it keeps too many people in poverty. So I want to show you here some examples of some things that have happened, because we are in a campaign right now as part of the We the People campaign to raise the minimum wage here in Pennsylvania. If you do live in Philadelphia, this might be one of your state representatives, Chris Rabb on the left. He has District 200. Chris Rabb is a We the People endorser, so he's endorsed our We the People campaign and our legislative platform. And so we can't have Harriet Tubman and others on the money at this point, so we put Chris Rabb on the money. So we have a man of color on the money right now. It's a $15 bill for a $15 an hour bill is what we're looking for. And then on the right-hand side, there are a few more of your representatives out of Philadelphia who've also endorsed our campaign. We have Representative Malcolm Kenyatta and Danny Burgos there. And if you're interested in learning more, you can text 33339, text wage to 33339, and you can learn more about how you can help us raise the minimum wage here in Pennsylvania. So there's examples of what we're kind of doing here to make sure that we're advocating for this. And, part of that first slide I showed you about agitating and organizing and working for this these are examples of some partnerships we've formed across the state. CASA is an outstanding organization that does a lot of work around immigrants' rights. We have our unions that are very helpful to us in trying to raise the wage because it's their workers that need to see this pay increase, SEIU. Rock United in the background, it's the Restaurant Opportunity Center, trying to raise the minimum wage for tipped workers. Um, I'm sure if some of you out there are waiting tables or you know someone who's waited tables, you should know that in the state of Pennsylvania, those folks are making $2.83 an hour. And if we don't tip them, they are making $2.83 an hour. And so we really need to make sure that we have one fair wage, and that's for all workers to raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour, and the tip workers. We need to raise their wage to $15 an hour as well, and then tip them on top of that because they deserve it. If you've ever waited tables, you know it's a hard job and they deserve that money. And so we've worked with other groups to help advocate for this, and we've mobilized our legislators and constituents to take action. And this is outside of Senator Jake Corman's office in Center County, right outside of Penn State main campus. And we worked there with the Center County for Wage Justice Coalition. So a lot of students there at Penn State University who are looking to raise the minimum wage because they know on campus they are making $7.25 an hour at some of their jobs, and college is super expensive. High school is super expensive. If you're trying to get involved in any activities, we all know how expensive high school and college can be. And so it's so important that we raise that minimum wage if we're going to have some wage justice. And we've mobilized people to take action. Here's an example of us outside of a representative's office. This is in Berks County, outside of Reading. If anyone out there is from that area. And so this is an opportunity for us. We had some younger folks there in the background too with the Sunrise Movement, if you're familiar with that organization, and others. And we were asking our legislator to have a heart. It was on Valentine's Day for this action. Asked him to have a heart and raise the minimum wage. Obviously, we were unsuccessful because the minimum wage still is $7.25 an hour here in Pennsylvania, but we're not going to stop. So, I like to show this slide as an example of why there's such inequality in our country, in our state, and in Philadelphia, of course. I want to show you this information here because I know personally I'm a product of the University of Pittsburgh. Both my parents went to the University of Pittsburgh. That's where they met. And when they were there in the late 60s, they were able to pay for college by working at a grocery store, bagging groceries. My mom graduated from college debt-free by bagging groceries at a grocery store. I'm sure you can't imagine that today. So back then in 1975, for example, a minimum wage worker only needed to work for 5.5 summers, and they could graduate from college debt-free during that time, not have that college debt. But today, young folks need to work for 18.5 summers in order to graduate debt-free. And most of you are not even alive 18.5 summers before you even go to college. So we see how impossible it is truly to graduate from college if you're not going on a scholarship or if you don't have assistance, to graduate without that debt. And I know myself personally, I went back to college later in my life. I am currently in student loan debt. So although I am not a millennial, I have debt like a millennial. And I'm sure that all of you are trying to work your way through not having that college debt. And so if we can raise the minimum wage, we can help change that for a lot of folks. So there's something called the Pennsylvania Promise that I want you to know. This is something we're advocating for in Harrisburg to cover tuition and fees for recent high school graduates, because I know many of you probably on this line today who are watching this have interest in going to college or trade school or what have you. And so if you can actually get our government to help assist in paying for your college, that would ensure that you wouldn't have so much debt when you get out of school. So it will cover 4 years of tuition and fees for recent high school graduates, as long as their family makes less than $110,000 a year and you get accepted into one of the state system of higher education schools. It would also provide an additional 4 years of grants up to $2,000. And that's if you attend a state-related university, from $2,000 up to $11,000 a year. And then it provides grants to adults without college degrees as well, if they're returning back to school and want to work in, in-demand skill industries. And so this is something we're advocating for right now to make sure that we're making college affordable. No one should start off their life in extreme debt. So, besides college funding, some of you still are in high school. There is an issue of inequality as it relates to our K through 12 schools here, kindergarten through 12th grade. And that the poorest third of students right now are getting $9,000 spent on their education a year. Yet the richest children in Pennsylvania They get more than $12,000 spent on their education each year. And that's an issue. We're talking about wage justice. We're talking about economic justice. We're talking about justice for everyone. And so when you have the richest kids getting more money spent on them than the poorest children, that's not fair. And what makes that not fair is that here in Pennsylvania, we fund our educational system through property tax. And so if you live in an area where properties don't have this great value, let's say in Philadelphia, like they may have in Lower Merion, right? So you have this disparity in wealth, which trickles down into the educational system. And so we have an issue that we need to solve there as it relates to inequalities in our Pennsylvania schools. Pennsylvania ranks fourth from the bottom in state higher education investment. So that's in terms of college education. We don't invest in our young folks here in the state of Pennsylvania, fourth from the bottom. We rank 40th out of 50 states as it relates to college adults. Um, Adults 25 through 64 having a college degree. So there's work to be done there as it relates to funding our education here in the state. And again, I'll give you some more stats just so you have them. I'm going to go back here for a moment to this slide here. And I want to remind you, that the state share of K through 12 education funding is so much lower now than it used to be in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the state government would pick up 55% of funding for your education, but today it's less than 30%. The rest of that funding comes out of property tax. So if we weren't relying on where you live, what your zip code is, to determine what kind of education you receive, we would be so much more fair to all children across the state, not just the ones who live in zip codes that can afford to have a great education. So these are a few things that we've talked about so far. So we've talked about K through 12 education funding. We've talked about college education funding. We've talked about wage justice, economic justice in terms of raising the minimum wage. There's other reasons why you should be so out there, encouraging people to vote that John, right? Tell them the reasons why. So I want to give you a few more reasons why it's so important. So in the introduction that Samira gave you, she told you that one of our campaigns is the We the People campaign. And that's the campaign that does work on, raising the minimum wage, making sure there's affordable housing, making sure we're securing our democracy and people are getting out to have access to the ballot and being able to vote. And then the other campaign is the Why Courts Matter campaign. And I'm going to show you how the Why Courts Matter campaign is all intertwined. This is all woven in, and we need to be able to talk about both things at the same time. And so when you're out there trying to encourage folks to register to vote, you need to talk to them about different cases that are impacting our lives and what's at stake in this election in November. And so one of those things at stake is the fact that so many of you are on your parents' insurance. And if the Supreme Court were to gut the Obamacare or the ACA, which allows you to stay on your parents' insurance until your mid-20s, you would have to actually pay for your own insurance. And so that's something we want to make sure we can continue on. If we're not going to get Medicaid for all, or Medicaid, if we're not going to have insurance for all, at least we can make sure that we're protecting young folks and keeping them on their parents' health insurance. And that's something to advocate for. So when someone says, I'm not registered to vote, it doesn't matter, does it make a difference? Well, the elections have consequences. And so depending upon the outcome of this election, it could determine who controls the Supreme Court even more than they control it now. And they could go ahead and take away a lot of the ACA protections, especially for young folks. And here again, we're still under this COVID-19 pandemic. The numbers are increasing depending upon what counties you live in. I know Dauphin County, where I live in Harrisburg, the numbers have increased. Philadelphia has increased. And so we have the opportunity where the federal courts, our Supreme Court of the United States, may hear a case, and they did hear a case regarding Pennsylvania's order of Governor Wolf, his response in terms of COVID and trying to close businesses down for as long as he did, which probably saved a lot of lives here in the state. But the Supreme Court of the United States heard a case about Pennsylvania as it relates to COVID-19. So more about how elections have consequences, more about how your vote isn't just for the president of the United States. You're voting for your state senators, your state representatives. And in some elections, you're voting for judges here in the state. I think those of you who are familiar with the Meek Mill case know that it was the Common Pleas Court of Appeals that has caused a lot of havoc in his life. And yet you can vote for these Common Pleas judges. Other things that the Supreme Court will hear in terms of birth control, that's important for a lot of folks out here. You have Josh Shapiro, our Attorney General, talking about this. The United States Supreme Court will hear cases regarding that. Also, Philadelphia is a sanctuary city. We make sure that we're taking care of everyone, not just a certain few. We are a country of immigrants. And so this is an opportunity for our Supreme Court and our federal courts to really protect the sanctuary cities like Philadelphia and protect those immigrants here in the country. Here's an example of North Carolina students. So these are students your age who are really expressing themselves, speaking truth to power, as Representative John Lewis would say, getting into good trouble. These are North Carolina students your age who are out there saying that they want this voter suppression that was happening to them in North Carolina to stop. And so this is something that you should be advocating for as well. No one should have the opportunity to take your rights away. So many fought so hard for you to have the right to vote. And so we can't allow that to happen. Other things you may be concerned about. Maybe it's the environment. Maybe it's those who are seeking asylum into this country. And so these are all things that are heard by the courts. And you get to choose what senators sit on, who sit in DC and determine what kind of judges we get on benches in that area. So a lot of other issues that the Supreme Court will hear that's important for you to know, because what happens on the Supreme Court happens in other courts across the country, in our lower courts, and also can impact our state courts as well. So I'm going to remind you of this, Representative John Lewis in his talking to us about wanting to disrupt the system and escalate and sacrifice. I'm going to show you an example here of that. This is an opportunity. You can see me down there on the floor. I can never hide my facial expressions. You'll always know exactly how I'm feeling by the way my face looks. But this was outside of Senator Chuck Grassley's office in DC. We wanted to do what Representative John Lewis said, and that was get in the way and disrupt. And we did that. We sat outside of his hallway and we were trying to stop a lower court appointment from happening in DC. And it was a great group of folks that we went down to DC from Pennsylvania. We made history that day. We were from all across the state. We were from Central PA. We were from Philadelphia area. We were younger, we were older. There were 2 college students with us that day and others, Black, white, gay, straight. I mean, we really looked like America going down to DC that day to disrupt. And we actually got arrested that day. Not that I'm here to advocate for you to do that. But this is part of civil disobedience. This is part of getting in the way when you feel as though what's going on in the world is not right and what's not just. So we called ourselves the Porter 9. There were 9 of us that got arrested that day trying to stop a lower court appointment. And that was the first time I had ever been arrested in my life. And I can tell you I've done it now 2 times since. So I'm on my 3rd arrest for trying to protect our civil rights and trying to protect our human rights and our voting rights. So this is an example of things that folks are doing. There's 2 young college students here that went with us. They were sophomores at the time, Jenny and Brianna, and that was also their first arrest. But we'll always be together and remember those moments of civil disobedience. So, I mean, I don't have too much more for you today in terms of a presentation. I want to be able to make this as back and forth as we can, and we can have some really good and lively discussion about this. So we've talked about tax reform and the need to tax folks, and I want to talk about that a little more. So I'm just going to go back and repeat something for you. We talked about during the education, how we're not funding schools properly here, and that comes out of property tax. There's a way around that so that we don't have to rely on just property tax to make sure that kids in Philadelphia and in Reading and in Harrisburg and in Philadelphia can have, and Pittsburgh can have the same kind of education as kids in Lower Merion, kids in King of Prussia. We want to make sure that that's fair for all. And so we're asking for our legislature in Harrisburg to institute something called a fair share tax, where we're actually taxing the rich. I think that's something that we don't do here in the state, and that's why we're usually in deficit or while we have issues in funding, is because we don't tax the folks who have the money. And when I say the rich, I'm talking about folks who are making $1.7 million a year. So that's not too many people out there making that amount of money. We have such a wealth inequality gap in the state where the rich are getting a lot richer and those who are struggling even more than ever. And so we're asking to tax the rich by $25,000 more a year. And when we say tax the rich, we can't just say, oh, just rich folks get this kind of tax. We're going to tax the things that only they have: capital gains, royalties, estate trust, lottery winnings, and not by that much more than they're already being taxed. Again, it would only be an increase to them around $25,000 out of 1.7 million, and they can afford that. We are taxing middle class folks well too much in the state. And if we were to actually tax the folks who have the money and not tax the folks who do not, we would stop taxing folks into poverty. So we're asking for a fair share tax plan, so that we can make sure that we are funding education and all the other critical needs that we have, especially in Philadelphia, and SNAP and Medicaid, to protect children and their families. So these are some of the things that we can do. We can do these things here in the state, and we can make sure that we're talking about these issues while we are talking about registering to vote, because all of these things are of importance. And so I'm going to stop my share here. And I hope that we can have some conversation, and maybe you all have some questions about anything that I've talked about today. And I'm willing to answer any of those. So I don't know how you want to handle this, Sonali or Samira, but I'm here. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kenner. Your talk was so incredible and informative. We do have some questions for you. So we have them compiled in a separate doc. And if it's okay with you, Samir and I are just going to take turns asking you those questions. So
Sure.
they're from other interns, but
Okay.
we're just asking them to you. So our first question is from one of our interns named Shamar. Being a college student myself, if the Pennsylvania Promise is enacted, would I be able to reap its benefits while already having been in college?
Okay. So tell me again, this person who's asking the question, they're currently in college?
Yes.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be a retroactive. But if you're still in college, if the Pennsylvania Promise goes through, yes, you'd be able to reap those benefits. This is the Pennsylvania Promise is something we've been working on for years. Haven't been able to get that improved. Senator Haywood and Senator Hughes, both out of Philadelphia, are big proponents of the Pennsylvania Promise. And I think that if they had a lot of young folks like yourself calling into their offices and saying, we need the Pennsylvania Promise, I don't want to graduate $70,000 in debt and start my life as a 21-year-old, $70,000 in debt, I think that's very impactful. Like I said, we've been trying to do this for many years, and it wouldn't be retroactive to you that's already in student loan debt. But who knows? We've been working towards canceling student loan debt. I know that there are candidates out there and others who have been proponents of canceling student loan debt. There's other opportunities as well. If you work for nonprofits, organizations for a certain amount of times that will take on your student loan debt after you've graduated. So there are those opportunities too. So good question.
Thank you for that. So the next question is from another one of our interns named Priya. So she asks, what do you think is the most urgent economic justice initiative? Which do you think could have the largest systemic impact?
Yeah, good question, Priya. That minimum wage. We tend to think that there's not a lot of folks who are making $7.25 an hour, but there's way too many folks making $7.25 an hour and $9 an hour. We should be at $22 an hour right now. Minimum wage should be around $22 an hour right now. That's a living wage. You cannot afford rent anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania by making $7.25 an hour and afford a one-bedroom apartment. You can also not afford to have a one-bedroom apartment and a car and a child and housing and food, making $9 an hour. So I think that if we can increase the minimum wage here, we're looking to pass a bill right now to make minimum wage $12 an hour immediately, and then go to $15 an hour by 2025. And that's what we're advocating for, so we can get closer to a living wage than we are, at a minimum wage that we're stuck in. I mean, it's the lowest possible wage possible. So if you think about a comedian, Chris Rock, he had said at one time, he said, well, if I'm paying someone $7.25, it's the least amount I can possibly pay you. So that's how much I really care about you. The least amount what I can pay you is what I'm paying you. And I think we can bring a lot of folks out of poverty. There's a lot of single moms who are currently making $9 an hour, $10 an hour. And some of these folks have college degrees. They're working in home health care, and they're doing other important jobs that we call now essential jobs, right? Jobs that were open now 24 hours during COVID. When some of us were able to stay home, these were essential workers that had to go out there and make a living and risk their lives to do that. So I think that Priya's question is, the biggest economic impact we can make is to raise the minimum wage, because when people have more money to spend, they will spend that money in their local communities. So if I'm making $7.25 an hour and you pay me $12 an hour, I'm going to spend all that additional money somewhere in my community. I'm going to buy better food. I'm going to maybe take my family on a vacation, because they deserve to have that as well. As a working person, they should be able to take their family on a vacation. And then that trickles down, so the businesses are making more money because there's more money in the community to be spent. And it works out better for everyone. It also raises the wage of those who are currently making $15 an hour. If you're making $15 an hour currently, your wage will rise as well, because employers will have to keep up with the wages as they rise. So Priya, my answer to that question is the minimum wage. If we can raise that, we're going to have a really big impact on families across the state, and especially in Philadelphia area.
Thank you so much. So our next question is about disparities. So your slides talked a lot about the economic injustice regarding education funding and minimum wage. But for some of us, in our intern group who don't live in PA or who are not PA locals, what does economic injustice and the wealth inequality gap look like across race, specifically Black and Brown people or other demographics?
Absolutely. Can you give me a little background, Sonali? What states are some of these folks coming from? Do you have that information?
Um, I know one of our other youth leaders is from Georgia, but she's not in this call. We have Texas. Samira's from Texas.
Okay.
I'm not Georgia. Yeah.
Okay.
I think Connecticut.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we've seen with the COVID-19 is that there's huge racial disparities. And so a lot of the country is waking up to racial injustice that has been systemic and part of this country's history since its founding. And so, yes, there are huge racial gaps, no matter where you're living, Connecticut, Georgia. Black folks, other people of color are making a lot less money than their white counterparts. And that also goes versus men versus women. The wage gap between genders is also a huge issue. We have, I think it's National Wage Day, when the average white woman catches up to the average white male in terms of wage. And it's really far into the year. I think it might be May or June when a white woman actually catches up to what a white male will make. And then it goes even longer for Black women, Latina women, and others to catch up. And so we have disparities not only in race across this country, but in terms of gender. I don't have specific numbers on me today to talk specifically about Georgia or Connecticut, but I can tell you that this is a systemic issue that is countrywide. We talked a little bit about minimum wage, and we talked about the tipped wage, and the fact that you have folks who are making $2.83 an hour while waiting tables. It can actually be as low as $2.13 an hour is the federal rate for those who are waiting tables. And that wage comes out of slavery days. There's history behind all of these inequalities that we have in this country. If we're talking about the housing issue and property tax, we can talk about redlining. We want to talk about why the minimum wage is so low and why there's a such thing as a tipped wage. It's all historical. And so, for instance, the tipped wage comes out of the days of Reconstruction, right after the slaves were freed. There was an opportunity for them to now be employed. And so some folks said, well, I still don't want to pay them any money. I'm used to not having to pay them a penny for their labor. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have them work, and they're going to serve us, and they're going to work as Pullman in the train industry, or they're going to work as servers. And then if we decide we want to give them a few pennies for them serving us, then we will. If we don't, then we don't tip them. And that is the system we're still living with today in 2020 that comes out of the slave days of not wanting to pay workers for their labor. So that's part of the inequality that we're living with today. What has happened in 1865 has trickled down to 2020, and it is still with us. That's part of us trying to solve the systemic and systematic racism that we're dealing with in this country, and what the Black Lives Matter movement has really brought to the forefront, and what a lot of folks are out there still in the streets to this day, months after George Floyd's murder, is that we're lifting up these issues. And it's important to know that so many of the issues that are impacting communities, particularly communities of color, are rooted in slavery and rooted in systemic racism in this country. And until we can address those issues, we're going to continue to have these problems.
Thank you so much for that. I didn't know the history behind the tip wage before that, so thank you. Um, so the next question is, why do you think Pennsylvania ranks so low compared to other Northeast states in terms of lowest minimum wage, higher education investment, and college education?
Yeah, good questions. So yeah, you saw that map and you saw every single state around us having a much higher minimum wage, even West Virginia. So when I take that graphic around and I travel, when I was able to travel prior to COVID and travel the state and talk about these issues, I would say, look at West Virginia. Even West Virginia has a minimum wage higher than Pennsylvania. And I think that that comes out of the fact that we've had a legislature in Harrisburg that just refuses to raise the minimum wage. They don't see the value in raising minimum wage. They believe that that's going to be a burden on local businesses or on small businesses, they call them. But actually, that's an opportunity for small business to make even more money and to maintain the workers that they have. One of the biggest costs to someone who owns a small business is turnover. When your employees leave you after being with you for a month or 3 months or 5 months, and you spent all that money into training them, that's a huge expense for businesses. That's an expense that labor is just one expense. So when folks talk about, oh, if you raise the minimum wage, I'm going to have to shut down my local business. I'm going to have to raise the price of pizza, or French fries are going to cost more. Well, actually, your French fries and your pizza may not go up that much. You can still get a 99-cent slice of pizza in New York City right now, and their minimum wage is much higher than $7.25 an hour. Like I said, you'll have people who can actually spend the money in the community, and so they'll spend that money in those local businesses. So when you ask that question, is why is it Pennsylvania having that issue? I think a lot of that comes out of who is currently in our legislature, and they decided right now that they don't think that Pennsylvanians are worth more than $7.25 an hour compared to the states that surround us who have different types of legislature. We the People campaign, I'm director of Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. We're a nonpartisan organization, so I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, but I can tell you what's happening out there and who currently sits in the legislature. And maybe we need to decide if they need to continue to sit there if they're not going to raise the minimum wage. I think part two of that question was about the education funding and why is it Pennsylvania so low? Pennsylvania chooses not to fund lower education, the K through 12 education or higher education like other states do. I talked about the fact that our funding comes out of property tax, where other states, their funding may come from something else like the lottery or other taxes that they have. We don't tax the rich. I want to make this very clear. We do not tax the rich enough in the state of Pennsylvania. And that is why we're in the situation we're in that other states local to us are not in. If we actually tax the rich their fair share, we'd have education funding for children across the state. We have to make sure that we are taxing the folks who actually have the money and stop taxing those who don't have the money into poverty. I hope that answered that question.
Thank you so much. We have another question from our intern, Cameron. Seeing the difference in numbers in terms of funding for public schools in the city of Philadelphia compared to Lower Merion, I can't help but think about gentrification. So I would like to know what gentrification means for students that attend city schools and how gentrification affects education.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So just so folks are, may have the question, what is gentrification in case you don't know? There's something going on right now in which people are being priced out of their homes. You have folks who have lived in the city of Philadelphia for generations, and maybe their property, when they purchased it, cost $40,000 for a 3-bedroom row house. But now they're moved into Northern Liberties or another area of the city where now it's costing a lot more money. And that $40,000 home that they purchased is now worth $300,000. That increases the property tax on that home. And a lot of those folks can't afford that tax anymore. And so they're forced into selling their house, and at a loss most times. But the question behind gentrification and how that's impacting funding for schools, I mean, yes, when property tax is raised and you're getting more of that because houses are now worth more in certain areas of Philadelphia, that will impact. But overall, the city of Philadelphia is in extreme poverty as it relates to housing. And not as many people own their houses in Philadelphia as they do in other cities or other suburbs of the state of Philadelphia. So that money isn't coming in that way. So yeah, I mean, if you're going to talk about, Northern Liberties or other little areas there in Philadelphia that are starting to be gentrified, yes, there's going to be a little more money coming in revenue, but it's not enough to impact all those students who are living in North Philly, in West Philly, and other places in the city.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Miss Carey, and she asked, what do you say to people who say that more taxing kills jobs?
Yeah. So more taxing kills jobs. There's lots of things that go into taxes and different ways in which we can raise revenue across the state. And studies have shown, for example, there's a study out of UC Berkeley that talks about, we'll just talk about the minimum wage for a second and how folks thought that if you were to raise the minimum wage, that would kill jobs. Well, that study showed because there are so many other things that are related into a small business, not just the labor cost, that there was no real impact on job loss because of the raise to the minimum wage in those areas. But no, I mean, taxes are a part of life, right, for a lot. And no, we don't see the studies in terms of killing jobs when you raise taxes here in the state of Pennsylvania. It's a false narrative that's been put out there for so long that we've kind of adopted it. And there's other costs that go into this and other ways in which we can raise revenue. We can close like the Delaware loophole where businesses can actually say that they're located in Delaware so that they can avoid paying taxes here in the state of Pennsylvania. Would make a big impact on our taxes here. If we were to actually just some of the laws that are on the books right now, or some of the things that we can actually change here in the state would really make a big impact. We just aren't taxing the right people. And we're letting them get away with too much. We're letting them get away with going out of state and then not paying taxes here into the state of Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, do we know a state that does education funding well? What and how do they do it?
Good question. In preparation for today, I kind of went through the map to see who's really doing education funding well, and it's different ways in which they fund it. Wyoming, I think, was the number one. They have the best funding for their students, was the state of Wyoming. Ranked at the bottom was Illinois and Pennsylvania and two other states. And I think it's just the way in which they do fund their schools. Like I said, here in Pennsylvania, it's pretty basic in terms of property taxes, how we fund schools. But if we were to actually, there's something called a fair funding formula that we're looking to pass through the money so that we can have more equitable schools here in Pennsylvania, where there's not such a difference if you live on the outskirts of Pittsburgh versus if you live in the city of Pittsburgh. But the fair funding formula, if we can run the money through there, and I think that that's a way that some of these other states do that, is that they have equitable money running through, and that students who live across the state have the same type of education versus here where we're relying on that property tax. That's what's making the big difference in other states, is that they're not relying on property tax to fund the schools. At one time, like I said, I think it was something like 55% of school funding came from our government, of Pennsylvania state government, and it went and it trickled into our public schools. But now that number is down to like 30%. And so we're relying on the property tax more than we are relying on other tax revenue that comes into the state.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Ananya. So she asks, how did you end up in issue advocacy after studying journalism? She says that she loves both of those fields and is curious as to how you transitioned, and how do you feel your background in journalism supports you in your work now?
Excellent question. I've gone through lots of career changes in my life. I started off as a restaurant manager. I did that for some time. And so that's how I know I can really speak to the minimum wage. I waited tables at Denny's to put myself through college the first time around. And so I've gone through some different career changes in my life, from restaurant management into retail management. I'm sure some of you have heard of the store Sephora, right? Some Sephora lovers out there, maybe. I opened up some of their stores in New Jersey, and I had the King of Prussia Mall and some other stores there. And so I did that. And then I went back to school in my 30s because I didn't want to do retail anymore. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that into my 60s. And so I wanted to follow my passion, which was always in journalism and sports journalism in particular. And I went back to school in my 30s to Temple, and I got my degree in broadcast journalism. And I was lucky enough to be able to go and work at ESPNU in Charlotte, North Carolina, right after getting my degree, and have an opportunity to write and produce television for sports programming, HBCU schools, mostly the Black colleges, universities. And so that was the kind of journalism I was in. I was producing, writing, directing football and basketball games for colleges, live and scripted TV. And so that was so much fun. And I found myself living in North Carolina at the time. If you're familiar with what was happening back in 2016, I think it was, 2016, there was something called the HB2 law. It was the bathroom law, in which you had to use the bathroom that corresponded with your gender at birth. And so that was really discriminatory against folks. And so what happened was the NCAA pulled out of North Carolina and said, we're not going to have any games here in North Carolina if you're going to be discriminatory against this LGBTQ community. We're going to pull out. So I found myself without a sports contract, work that I was doing for just a few weeks. And the Hillary, in transparency, the Hillary campaign called me and asked if I wanted to volunteer in their offices in North Carolina. And I said, actually, I had worked on Obama's campaign in 2008 as a volunteer coordinator, and that I did have experience in that. And so I went to go work on that campaign as the field organizer in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I got that really great picture that you saw with John Lewis outside that office. And so I did that work. And I decided after that 2016 election, when the outcome wasn't what I particularly wanted it to be, I decided that I couldn't go back to working in sports journalism and having so much fun inside a production truck and having that good time. I wanted to defend democracy. And so I went into issue advocacy with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. I was pre-law in college the first time around, so I did have a little bit of a law background and enjoyed that profession. I know that the courts have been able to grant rights. As a Black woman, I know that my rights have been granted and also taken away by the courts. And so when I had the opportunity to move back home to Pennsylvania to work on that Why Courts Matter project, I took it up. The question was also, how is the journalism background helpful in what I'm doing? Is that what you learn in journalism one-on-one is to follow the money. And so a lot of what I do is following the money to see how I can bring about outcomes that are different currently. So I can tell you that so much of my background has been helpful in the work I do. So even as a retail stores manager, that background is important. It's all transferable skills into what I'm doing now, where I can be able to relate to the public and speak to the public and be engaged in having speaking engagements like this and talking to folks. So all of that is, relative experience that you're going to gain no matter what kind of industry you go in right after school. Like I said, I've changed my careers 3-4 times, and I might have one more still in me. Who knows? But I can tell you that, yes, as a journalist by trade, just learning how to investigate, how that you can use the different programs that are out there to track down information, how you can Google fiercely and quickly when you need to find the answers to things and be creative. So yeah, the journalism degree really did help in the work that I'm doing now, and it enables me to communicate with folks, follow the money, and listen intently to what's going on to find out what it is that the problems are that need addressed.
Thank you so much. We have a question from our intern, Michaela. Philadelphia is a city with a lot of large universities and colleges that have money. Do you think those institutions are in a position to help the Philadelphia education system or wages in the city? Are they taxed properly?
Good question. Good question. So that's something I haven't followed the money on that one, on that part. So I need to do a little more research there. But I know that there's a lot of colleges have certain endowments that they have that they can assist in making tuition more affordable. I can tell you right now that the reason why there are so many folks in the Pennsylvania area who are suffering so much of student loan debt is college in Pennsylvania is so expensive here in Pennsylvania compared to other states, and we don't fund it the way other states do. Where the state is actually giving money into these colleges and universities for their, to help with tuition. The cost of tuition rises every year. You saw that graphic that I showed you back in the 70s where you could bag groceries and graduate debt free. You can't do that today. The cost of education has increased so that it's almost out of reach for some folks. without going into debt or trying to get scholarships. So, it just depends on the college. I can't tell you that I've investigated any of them in particular in terms of how they're taxed or how they are, using endowments and funding that they have to assist students. But that's definitely something to look at. And now you've given me a project. So thank you.
Thank you. So our next question is from Miss Carrie, and she wants to know how specifically we can research judges or how we can tell other youth how to.
Absolutely. Good question. So I wish I was able to do a full Why Courts Matter presentation for you today. That's my passion project. And I can tell you that what is happening currently on the federal benches. So there's two ways, right? So there's the federal judges that are appointed by the President of the United States and then confirmed by the Senate. And then there's judges that we vote on here in the state of Pennsylvania. So we vote on our common pleas judges, we vote on our appellate court judges, like our Commonwealth Court here in Pennsylvania, our Superior Court in Pennsylvania, and our Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And so I can tell you that it's very difficult to find information on judges who are running for office in Pennsylvania, because now it's become politicized where these folks need to raise lots of money to run for office. And so in order to do that, they also need to find you where you are and tell them why it is you select them as a judge. And I found myself as someone who's pretty knowledgeable as it relates to these judges across the state on election day, sometimes needing to Google someone and say, all right, let me Google this judge, or let me go onto their Facebook page and see what they're doing on the weekends. Is this someone that I want to sit on a bench that may one day be my final arbiter, make a decision about my life or or my family's life? And so I've gone to their Facebook pages and I see what they do on the weekends. Are they volunteering at the Boys and Girls Club, or are they golfing, out in King of Prussia? That's what I want to know about someone who wants to be a judge that could, determine things about my life and make determinations about my life. And so it's important that you just do your own due diligence. A quick Google will tell you a lot of things. We also retain judges or decide not to retain judges here in Pennsylvania. Once we vote on them and they become a judge, 10 years later, they're up for retention voting. And then when you go to vote on them, you say yes or no. And you don't know what political party they belong to at that time either. The R and the D is removed behind their name. And so you have to go into that poll and say, okay, I want to retain this judge, but you may not know if that's a good judge or not. Is this the judge that, made Meek Mill's life miserable? Or is this a judge who has lived experiences like mine and comes maybe from a lower income and understands what it's like to be poor and grow up and can make determinations that way? So I found myself on election day needing to Google a judge that was up for retention. And then I found information out about him and I hit the no button to retain. Because most of the times when you go to the polls, folks will just say yes on a question like that, because you don't want to say no if you don't know what you're saying no to. So it just, it comes down to that. This year is different. You'll have the opportunity to vote by mail this year. And so you have the opportunity to sit down at your kitchen table with your family and your friends, and you can look at these people's names and you can do your due diligence and you can Google them and you can learn more about them and make really informed decisions about who you're voting for. You don't have to worry about just going into the booth and hitting yes or no to someone. You can actually really sit down and take your time and figure out who it is that you want to put in these powerful positions, because they're making lots of decisions about your life and sometimes without you.
Thank you so much. So we have one of our interns, Shamar, who has a question for you. So I'm just going to ask Shamar if you'll turn your video on and ask your question.
Sorry, I had to remember what my question was for a minute. So you mentioned Senator Lewis's quote earlier, disrupt, get into good trouble. So my question is, what is the best way to disrupt? Besides voting, we're all very, very inclined to voting. What is the best way to disrupt? What is the best way to get in some good trouble to inspire change?
Good, March. Good question, Shamar. Good question. So I can tell you this, politicians are very scared of you. If you show up at one of their offices, if it's safe to do that nowadays, if you can show up to one of their offices and talk about the issues that matter to you and be informed, that is a great way to get in the way, because they like to operate, in the cloak of darkness think that we're not paying attention to them. But what's happened in the last few years is that people are paying attention to what our politicians are doing. And that's our local level all the way up to the federal government. And so they are scared of you. And if you can get 3 of you to show up in someone's office and say, you know, I want you to look into this Pennsylvania promise because I don't want to graduate $70,000 in debt. That's a groundswell of opinion because these politicians are not used to having someone show up at their office. There's other ways you can do that as well. I mean, yeah, there's phone calls you can make, and there's emails you can send, and you can send faxes as well because some of our politicians get faxes because they don't answer their phones. So there's different ways that you can do that. You can also write letters to the editor. They don't like to see their name in the paper. I can tell you I've written lots of letters to the editor in regards to Senator Toomey and the fact that he's been rubber stamping some really problematic judges to our benches here in Pennsylvania. And I can tell you that when I went to go visit his office in DC and I shook his communications director hand, he said, "Oh, I know who you are. You write letters to the editor." So it's very important to get in the way in terms of what you can do safely. I'm not advocating for anyone to get arrested, have the way I have, 3 times, but I can tell you, I never felt more powerful in my life than when I had my handcuffs put on me and I was restrained and put into a wagon to go off to Capitol Police. When I took my mugshot, they had to tell me to stop smiling. And I think Representative Lewis said the same thing about one of his times when he was arrested, because you're up to civil disobedience for a good reason, right? I wasn't out there getting arrested for doing something horrible. I was exercising my First Amendment right. So there's different ways you can do that. So Shamar, to answer that question quickly, it is getting in the way means to show up at their district offices because they're not used to seeing you and they are scared to death of you. They don't want to see folks in their offices talking about issues. They may not even know what the issues are. We tend to think that our local politicians and others are so smart, right? Well, yeah, a lot of them are smart. They got to where they are today, but that doesn't mean they know all of the issues and what the issues are that you're telling them about or what you care about. So go in there with your facts. So go into those district offices with your facts in your back pocket and advocate for what it is that you need because they're not used to seeing you in there. And if you want to, when you get to be 18 years old, if you're not already and you're interested in some good trouble, I'll give you my email address. You can always reach out to me in case I decide to do that again.
That sounds absolutely amazing. And I would love to have your email address to speak further about these things.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kenner, for your time. Your talk has been so motivational and eye-opening. And I know I'm not just speaking for myself. So thank you so much again. And I just want to turn it over to Ms. Carey and Peter if they have anything else to say.
I have to say thank you. I have to say thank you on all our behalf. I've done a little bit of live tweeting during this time. We've been taking notes. We're going to think about this. We're going to put this, take little bits of this and chop it up and send it around to social media. We are so grateful, and I'm sure you will hear from some of us in future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was so incredible. The question that Shamar had asked, this is why I do this work, because of young folks like yourself who care about these issues, and you continue to inspire me, and you've given me a bounce on my step on a Monday to take this even further. So thank you for all the work that you are out there doing every day. And hopefully the action you're going to be able to take if you're old enough to be able to cast your ballot as early as September 14th. That's when early voting starts here in the state because of the mail-in ballot.
Right.
Yes, September 14th is the day. And so sit home with your family and loved ones. If you know someone who says, I'm not going to vote, it just doesn't impact my life. There's so much that impacts your life. And if a vote didn't matter, especially that person who lives in Georgia, you would know why they're trying to take these rights away from you. If your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't try so hard to take your vote away and suppress your vote and oppress your vote. So please do that.